Marcus had always been the boy who tried too hard. In his small hometown of Cedar Falls, where everyone knew everyone's business, he was known as the kid who stumbled over his own feet during basketball tryouts, who raised his hand eagerly in class only to give the wrong answer, and who practiced piano until his fingers bled but still couldn't play a simple melody without hitting wrong notes. The other children whispered behind his back. Teachers exchanged knowing glances when his name appeared on their class lists. Even his own parents, though they loved him dearly, had quietly lowered their expectations after years of watching their son fail at everything he attempted with such desperate enthusiasm. But Marcus never stopped trying. Every morning, he woke up with the same burning determination that had carried him through countless disappointments. He joined the school debate team despite his tendency to stutter when nervous. He signed up for track and field even though he always finished last in every race. He auditioned for school plays knowing he would likely end up painting backdrops instead of performing on stage. His classmates found his persistence both admirable and pitiful. Sarah Chen, the valedictorian, once told her friends that watching Marcus was like watching someone bang their head against a brick wall, hoping it would eventually break. The popular kids weren't cruel to him exactly, but they treated him with the kind of distant kindness reserved for someone they considered fundamentally different from themselves. The teachers were perhaps the most frustrating part of Marcus's daily struggle. Mrs. Henderson, his math teacher, would sigh audibly whenever he approached her desk with questions. Mr. Rodriguez, who coached the soccer team, had stopped calling on Marcus during practice scrimmages after the third time he accidentally kicked the ball into his own goal. Even Miss Patterson, the art teacher who prided herself on encouraging creativity, seemed to lose patience when Marcus's paintings invariably turned into muddy, unrecognizable swirls of color. Marcus's parents, David and Linda, watched their son's struggles with hearts full of love and worry. David worked double shifts at the local factory, dreaming of saving enough money to give Marcus opportunities he never had. Linda spent her evenings helping Marcus with homework, patiently explaining concepts that seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. They celebrated his small victories with the same enthusiasm they might have shown for major achievements, hoping to keep his spirit alive in a world that seemed determined to crush it. The family dinner table became a place of careful encouragement and gentle redirection. When Marcus would come home devastated about another failed test or missed opportunity, his parents would listen patiently and then help him find something positive to focus on. They never told him to give up, but sometimes David would lie awake at night wondering if their encouragement was helping or hurting their son's chances of finding peace with his limitations. Marcus's bedroom walls were covered with participation certificates, honorable mention ribbons, and photos from events where he had tried his best but never quite succeeded. His desk was always cluttered with books about subjects he was passionate about but struggled to master, notebooks filled with practice problems he couldn't solve, and art supplies from projects that never turned out quite right. The breaking point came during his junior year of high school. Marcus had spent months preparing for the state academic decathlon, studying subjects from literature to science with an intensity that worried his parents. He practiced answering questions until he could recite facts in his sleep. He worked with tutors, formed study groups with classmates who barely tolerated his presence, and sacrificed every weekend for months to prepare. On the day of the competition, Marcus felt as ready as he had ever felt for anything. He had visualized success, prepared for every possible question category, and even practiced his posture and breathing to manage his anxiety. But when the questions began, his mind went blank. The facts he had memorized scattered like leaves in the wind. His teammates watched in embarrassed silence as he struggled through question after question, providing wrong answers or simply staring helplessly at problems he had solved dozens of times in practice. The ride home was silent, except for the gentle hum of the engine and the sound of Marcus trying not to cry. His teammates stared out their windows, and the coach who had reluctantly included him on the team seemed to be mentally planning how to break the news to the principal that their weakest link had cost them any chance at placing in the competition. That night, Marcus sat in his room, surrounded by all the evidence of his efforts and failures. For the first time in his life, he seriously considered giving up. The voice in his head that sounded like every teacher who had ever sighed at his questions, every classmate who had ever rolled their eyes at his mistakes, and every coach who had ever looked past him when choosing teams, grew louder than his own determination. His mother found him there at 2 a.m, sitting on his bed with his head in his hands. She didn't offer empty reassurances or try to minimize his pain. Instead, she sat beside him and said something that would change everything. Sometimes the world doesn't see what we're capable of until we show them something they never expected. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived that would set Marcus's life on an entirely new path. The United States Army was visiting high schools in their area, looking for young people who might be interested in military service. Marcus had never considered the military before. In his mind, soldiers were strong, confident, naturally gifted people. Nothing like him. But something about the recruiter's presentation caught his attention. Staff Sergeant Williams talked about the military as a place where ordinary people discovered extraordinary capabilities within themselves. He spoke about young men and women who had been overlooked by the world but found their purpose in service. Most importantly, he talked about leaders who could see potential where others saw only problems. Marcus approached the recruitment table after the presentation, his usual anxiety mixing with an unfamiliar flutter of hope. Staff Sergeant Williams looked at him with eyes that seemed to see something different than what everyone else had always seen. When Marcus stumbled through his questions about military service, the sergeant didn't appear impatient or dismissive. Instead, he listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions in return. The conversation lasted longer than Marcus had expected. Staff Sergeant Williams asked about his interests, his goals, and his experiences with challenges. When Marcus mentioned his string of failures and disappointments, the sergeant nodded thoughtfully and said something that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. Some of our best soldiers are the ones who had to fight the hardest to get where they are. They understand struggle in a way that makes them invaluable when things get tough. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself thinking constantly about the possibility of military service. His parents were supportive but worried. They had seen their son's heart broken too many times to feel entirely optimistic about this new direction. His classmates were skeptical in the way that only teenagers can be, making jokes about Marcus finally finding a place where they would have to keep him even if he couldn't do anything right. But Marcus felt something stirring inside him that he had never experienced before. It wasn't the familiar, desperate hope that had driven him through countless failures. This was different, quieter, but stronger. It felt like recognition, as if some part of himself that had been sleeping was finally beginning to wake up. The bus to basic training was filled with young men and women from all walks of life. But Marcus felt more alone than he ever had. Some of his fellow recruits boasted about their athletic achievements or talked confidently about their plans to excel in the military. Others sat quietly. But even their silence seemed more assured than Marcus's nervous fidgeting. When they arrived at Fort Moore, the drill sergeants began their systematic breakdown of every recruit's civilian identity. For most of Marcus's fellow soldiers, this was a shock. They had been the stars of their high school football teams, the leaders of their social groups, the ones who had always succeeded. But for Marcus, having his assumptions about himself challenged felt strangely liberating. Drill Sergeant Torres was a compact man with intense eyes who seemed to see through every excuse and pretense. During the first week, he singled out recruits for both praise and correction with equal intensity. Marcus waited for the inevitable moment when this new authority figure would recognize him as the failure everyone else had always seen. Instead, something unexpected happened. During the first physical training session, Marcus struggled with push-ups just as he had struggled with everything else in his life. But when Drill Sergeant Torres approached him, instead of mockery or dismissal, Marcus heard something different. "Thompson, your form is wrong, but your effort is right. Drop and give me 10 more, and this time listen to your body instead of fighting it." The correction was firm but not cruel. More importantly, it came with instruction rather than judgment. For the first time in his life, Marcus felt like someone was trying to help him succeed rather than simply documenting his failure. Over the following days, he began to notice that Drill Sergeant Torres's corrections always came with specific guidance about how to improve. Basic training revealed something about Marcus that no civilian instructor had ever discovered. He was absolutely relentless. While other recruits complained about the difficulty, Marcus absorbed every challenge with the same determination that had carried him through years of civilian failures. The difference was that here, persistence was valued rather than pitied. During the obstacle course training, Marcus was initially the slowest in his unit. But while other recruits grew frustrated with repeated attempts, Marcus seemed to gain energy from each failure. He studied every successful completion by his fellow soldiers, broke down the movements into components he could understand, and practiced elements of the course during any free time he could find. Private Johnson, a former high school quarterback who had initially dismissed Marcus as dead weight, found himself grudgingly impressed. "Thompson never quits," he told another recruit after watching Marcus complete his 50th attempt at a particularly challenging wall climb. Kid's been failing at that thing for 2 weeks, but he keeps coming back like it's the first time he's trying it. What Johnson and the others didn't understand was that failure had never devastated Marcus the way it devastated them. He had been failing publicly his entire life and had learned to extract lessons from disappointment in ways that people who expected success simply couldn't. Each obstacle course attempt taught him something new about timing, technique, or mental approach. Drill Sergeant Torres began to watch Marcus with growing interest. In 15 years of training recruits, he had seen every type of soldier. There were the natural athletes who excelled immediately, the intelligent ones who mastered techniques through analysis, and the competitive ones who succeeded through sheer force of will. But Marcus was different. He approached each challenge as if he genuinely enjoyed the process of figuring it out, regardless of how long it took. The breakthrough came during weapons training. Marcus had expected to struggle with marksmanship just as he had struggled with every other skill-based activity in his life. His first attempts confirmed this expectation. His shots scattered across the target in patterns that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Other recruits snickered, and Marcus felt the familiar weight of being the weak link in any group effort. But Sergeant Torres pulled him aside after the third day of poor performance. Instead of criticism, he asked a question that surprised Marcus. "Thompson, what do you think about when you're aiming?" Marcus explained that he tried to remember all the technical instructions about breathing, stance, sight alignment, and trigger control simultaneously. "That's your problem," Torres said. "You're thinking too much. Your brain works differently than most people's, and you're trying to force it to work like theirs. Stop trying to remember everything at once and start feeling your way through it." The advice seemed counterintuitive to Marcus, who had always been told he needed to think harder, concentrate more, and follow instructions more precisely. But Torres was the first instructor who seemed to believe Marcus could succeed, so he decided to trust the guidance completely. The next day, Marcus approached the firing line with a completely different mindset. Instead of mentally reciting the checklist of technical points, he focused on the simple goal of hitting the target. He let his body find a comfortable position, rather than forcing it into the exact stance he had been taught. He breathed naturally rather than following the prescribed breathing pattern. Most importantly, he stopped anticipating failure and simply focused on the immediate task. His first shot hit the target, not the bullseye, but solidly within the scoring rings. His second shot was closer to the center. By his 10th shot, he was grouping consistently in a way that surprised everyone watching, including himself. Drill Sergeant Torres nodded with satisfaction, but his only comment was, "Now you're getting somewhere, Thompson. Keep that up." Over the following weeks, Marcus's transformation accelerated. The same qualities that had made him seem hopeless in civilian life became assets in the military environment. His persistence, which teachers had found exhausting, became the foundation of his reputation as someone who never gave up on his fellow soldiers. His habit of asking questions, which had annoyed his classmates, made him someone other recruits turned to when they needed help understanding complex procedures. Most importantly, his experience with failure had taught him something that many of his more naturally gifted fellow recruits lacked: the ability to stay calm and focused when things went wrong. During night training exercises, when equipment malfunctioned or weather conditions made everything more difficult, Marcus remained steady, while others became frustrated and made mistakes. Private Chen, who had been the star recruit during the first weeks of training, found herself struggling during a particularly challenging field exercise. Equipment problems and bad weather had turned what should have been a straightforward navigation course into a grueling test of problem-solving and endurance. As other members of their unit began to panic and make poor decisions, Marcus quietly took charge of troubleshooting their equipment problems and finding alternative routes to their objectives. "How are you so calm?" Chen asked him during a brief rest break. "Everyone else is freaking out, but you act like this is just another day." Marcus considered the question seriously before answering. "I guess I've had a lot of practice with things not going the way they're supposed to." When you expect everything to be difficult, nothing really catches you off guard. Word of Marcus's steady performance under pressure began to reach the drill sergeants. During evaluation meetings, Drill Sergeant Torres found himself defending a recruit he had initially written off as a project case. "Thompson's not the fastest or the strongest," he told his fellow instructors, "but he's got something that can't be taught. When everything goes wrong, he gets better, not worse." This observation proved prophetic during the final field training exercise. The scenario was designed to test everything the recruits had learned under conditions that deliberately pushed them beyond their comfort zones. Equipment would malfunction, Weather would be harsh and timeline would be compressed to create maximum stress. Marcus's unit was assigned one of the most challenging objectives: establishing a defensive position under simulated enemy fire while coordinating with other units whose radio communications were being deliberately jammed. Natural leaders in the group tried to take charge but quickly became overwhelmed by the complexity and stress of the situation. As plans fell apart and frustration mounted, Marcus did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He didn't try to take command or impose his will on the situation. Instead, he began quietly solving problems, one at a time. When radio communications failed, he organized a system of runners to maintain contact with other units. When defensive positions proved inadequate, he identified better locations and helped organize the movement. When other recruits became rattled by the intensity of the simulated combat, he remained focused on the immediate tasks that needed to be completed. His approach wasn't dramatic or inspiring in the way that movie heroes lead their troops. It was methodical, calm, and effective. He treated the chaos of the exercise the same way he had treated every other challenge in his life, as a series of specific problems that could be solved through patience, persistence, and attention to detail. Colonel Mitchell had been observing the exercise from a position that allowed him to watch all the units simultaneously. As a career officer with 30 years of experience, he had developed an eye for spotting future leaders among the chaos of training exercises. What caught his attention about Marcus wasn't any single dramatic moment, but rather the steady competence he displayed when everything around him was falling apart. Colonel Mitchell had seen thousands of soldiers come through basic training, but something about the quiet recruit in Delta Company caught his attention during the final field exercise. While other soldiers either crumbled under pressure or tried to dominate through force of personality, this young man seemed to find clarity in chaos. After the exercise concluded, Colonel Mitchell made an unusual request. He asked to review the complete training files for Recruit Thompson, something he rarely did for soldiers who weren't already being recommended for advanced programs. What he found intrigued him even more than what he had observed in the field. Marcus's file told the story of consistent struggle, followed by steady improvement. His initial physical fitness scores had been among the lowest in his class, but his progress curve was steeper than almost anyone else's. His written test scores showed the same pattern. Weak performance early on, followed by dramatic improvement once he found his rhythm. Most telling were the instructor comments, which evolved from skeptical to impressed over the course of training. But it was Drill Sergeant Torres's final evaluation that convinced Colonel Mitchell he was looking at something special. Recruit Thompson doesn't have natural talent in the conventional sense, but he has something rarer and more valuable. He has the ability to maintain effectiveness when systems break down and normal procedures don't work. In 15 years of training soldiers, I've never seen anyone who gets better as conditions get worse. 3 days before graduation, Colonel Mitchell did something unprecedented. He requested a private meeting with Marcus. The young soldier reported to the colonel's office, expecting to be disciplined for some unknown infraction. Instead, he found himself facing a career officer who looked at him with the kind of respect he had never experienced from any authority figure. "Thompson," Colonel Mitchell began, "your drill sergeants tell me you've had an interesting journey through basic training. I've been watching soldiers for a long time, and I've learned to recognize certain qualities that don't show up on standard evaluations. I think you have the potential to contribute to this organization in ways that might surprise everyone, including yourself." Marcus listened in stunned silence as the colonel offered him an opportunity to attend advanced individual training in a field that specialized in problem-solving under extreme conditions. It wasn't a glamorous assignment, but it was one that required exactly the kind of steady competence Marcus had displayed during the most challenging parts of basic training. "I need soldiers who can think clearly when everything is going wrong," Colonel Mitchell explained. "Most people freeze up or make poor decisions under that kind of pressure. But some people, like you, seem to find their focus when chaos hits. That's not a common trait, and it's extremely valuable. The assignment would mean additional training, greater responsibilities, and higher expectations. For someone who had spent his entire life being underestimated, the prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. But Marcus had learned to trust the unfamiliar feeling of someone believing in his potential. Advanced individual training proved to be everything Colonel Mitchell had promised and more. Marcus found himself working with equipment and procedures that required the kind of methodical problem-solving that had always been his strength. More importantly, he was surrounded by instructors who valued persistence and careful thinking over flashy performance. Sergeant Major Rodriguez, who oversaw the advanced training program, had been briefed about Marcus by Colonel Mitchell. "I hear you're the recruit who gets better when things get worse," she said during their first meeting. "We're about to test that theory pretty thoroughly. The training was designed to simulate real-world conditions where standard procedures wouldn't work and soldiers would have to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Marcus thrived in this environment in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. The same qualities that had made him seem slow and clumsy in civilian life became assets when dealing with complex technical problems under pressure. During one particularly challenging exercise, Marcus's unit was tasked with maintaining critical communications equipment while under simulated enemy fire. The exercise was designed so that multiple systems would fail simultaneously, forcing soldiers to improvise solutions using limited resources and minimal time. Marcus approached the problem the same way he had approached every other challenge in his life, by breaking it down into manageable pieces and working through them systematically. While other soldiers became frustrated with equipment failures and time pressure, Marcus maintained his methodical approach, troubleshooting problems in order of priority and finding creative solutions when standard procedures didn't work. His performance during that exercise earned him recognition from instructors who had been skeptical about Colonel Mitchell's assessment. Sergeant Major Rodriguez noted in her evaluation, "Soldier Thompson demonstrates exceptional problem-solving abilities under adverse conditions. His approach to complex technical challenges shows maturity and creativity that would be valuable in any operational environment." But the real test came during the final month of advanced training, when Marcus's unit was assigned to work with a visiting team of special operations soldiers who were evaluating new equipment and procedures. These were elite troops with extensive combat experience, exactly the kind of naturally gifted, supremely confident soldiers that Marcus had always assumed represented everything he could never be. The special operations team was led by Master Sergeant Williams, a decorated veteran with multiple combat deployments who had volunteered to test new communication systems under realistic training conditions. His initial assessment of Marcus's unit was politely skeptical. These were young soldiers with limited experience, and he doubted they would be able to keep up with the demanding pace of special operations training. The first few days seemed to confirm his expectations. Most of the soldiers in Marcus's unit struggled with the complex procedures and high-stress scenarios that were routine for special operations forces. But Master Sergeant Williams began to notice that one soldier consistently performed better as conditions became more challenging. During a night training exercise that combined equipment failures with time pressure and physical exhaustion, Marcus not only maintained his own performance but began helping other soldiers work through problems they couldn't solve on their own. His approach wasn't to take over their tasks, but rather to help them think through problems systematically and maintain focus when frustration threatened to overwhelm them. Master Sergeant Williams pulled Marcus aside after the exercise. "Where did you learn to stay that calm under pressure?" he asked. "Most soldiers with your level of experience would have been overwhelmed by tonight's scenario." Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "I guess I've had a lot of practice with things being difficult," he said. "When you're used to struggling with everything, you learn not to panic when things get hard." The Master Sergeant studied him for a moment before nodding. "That's an unusual way to develop stress tolerance, but it seems to work for you. How would you feel about some additional training opportunities?" Over the following weeks, Master Sergeant Williams began including Marcus in advanced scenarios that were typically reserved for much more experienced soldiers. The young man's performance consistently exceeded expectations. Not because he was naturally gifted, but because his experience with struggle had taught him to approach difficult situations with patience and systematic thinking. Word of Marcus's unusual talents eventually reached Colonel Mitchell, who had been following his progress through official reports and informal updates from training instructors. The colonel wasn't surprised by the positive evaluations, but he was impressed by the consistency of the feedback from different sources. 6 months after graduation from basic training, Marcus received orders that would have seemed impossible to him a year earlier. He was being assigned to a specialized unit that supported high-level military operations requiring technical expertise and the ability to perform under extreme pressure. It was exactly the kind of assignment that would typically go to soldiers with years of experience and proven track records. Colonel Mitchell personally delivered the news, along with a promotion that reflected Marcus's rapid development and growing reputation. "Thompson," he said, "a year ago, your drill sergeant told me you were the kind of soldier who got better when things got worse. I'm about to give you the opportunity to prove that on a much larger stage." The assignment came with responsibilities that would have terrified the high school student who had once struggled through academic competitions. Marcus would be working with some of the military's most elite units, providing technical support for operations where failure could have serious consequences. But the young man who accepted those orders was fundamentally different from the boy who had left Cedar Falls. He had discovered that his greatest weakness, his experience with constant struggle, was actually his greatest strength. In a world where most people expected things to go smoothly and became ineffective when they didn't, Marcus had learned to maintain focus and find solutions regardless of circumstances. On his last day of advanced training, Marcus wrote a letter to his parents that tried to explain the transformation he had experienced. "I always thought there was something wrong with me because everything was so hard," he wrote. "But it turns out that learning to deal with hard things was preparing me for something I never could have imagined. The colonel says I have a gift for staying calm when systems break down. I never thought my problems would turn out to be my strength." Years later, Master Sergeant Williams would use Marcus as an example when training new soldiers about the unpredictable nature of military potential. "Some of our best operators are people who had to fight for everything they ever achieved," he would tell recruits. "They understand struggle in a way that makes them invaluable when operations don't go according to plan. Never assume that someone who struggles early on can't become exceptional given the right environment and leadership." Colonel Mitchell, now a general, kept Marcus's training file as a reminder of the importance of looking beyond surface performance to identify deeper qualities that might not be immediately apparent. "True leadership often emerges from unexpected places," he would tell junior officers. "Our job is to create conditions where every soldier has the opportunity to discover what they're capable of, especially the ones who don't fit conventional patterns of success." Marcus's story became legendary within his unit, not because he had overcome impossible odds, but because he had discovered that qualities the civilian world had seen as weaknesses were actually strengths in the right environment. His journey from the struggling student everyone doubted to the soldier everyone depended on proved that potential often hides in the most unlikely places, waiting for someone with the wisdom to recognize it and the patience to help it develop. The boy who had once failed at everything he tried had become a man whose greatest skill was succeeding when failure seemed inevitable. In finding his place in the military, Marcus had discovered something more valuable than natural talent: the ability to remain effective when everything else fell apart, a quality that would serve him and his fellow soldiers for the rest of his career.